Hello, everyone. Good evening, good afternoon, good morning. Thank you so much for joining this special Laudato Si dialogue all about turning climate angst into climate action. My name is Jonathan Braden with the Laudato Si movement, and it is a pleasure to be joining you today as we dive into this heavy topic, but also very important topic as climate anxiety, climate angst is affecting millions of people around the world, but there are things that we all can do about it. And that's what we're going to talk about today with our exceptional panel of speakers, as you can see there. A couple housekeeping notes before we get started. Please let us know in the chat on Facebook and YouTube where you're watching. Say hello. And we want to encourage any and all questions because we'll have time throughout the dialogue for questions and we want to hear your concerns. What are you experiencing climate anxiety, climate angst, and how do you turn it into climate action? So we wanted to talk about climate angst and climate action because of Pope Francis' prophetic leadership in November. He talked about his November prayer intention was people who suffer from depression. We pray that people who suffer from depression or burnout will find support and a light that opens them up to life. And obviously, in the Laudato Si movement, we're all about mobilizing and inspiring the Catholic Church to achieve ecological justice and climate justice. And part of that is overcoming the anxiety that comes with, that God's creation is being harmed. God's creation is suffering. And here is Pope Francis, the prayer intention.
La sobrecarga de trabajo, el estrés laboral, hacen que muchas personas experimenten un agotamiento extremo, un agotamiento mental, emocional, afectivo y físico. De ahí la tristeza, la apatía, el cansancio espiritual terminan por dominar la vida de las personas que se ven desbordados por el ritmo de la vida actual. Procuremos estar cerca de los que están agotados, de los que están desesperados, sin esperanza. Muchas veces escuchando simplemente en silencio, porque no podemos ir a decirle a una persona, no, la vida no es así. Sí, escúchame, yo te doy la receta. No hay receta. Y además, no olvidemos que junto al imprescindible acompañamiento psicológico, útil y eficaz, las palabras de Jesús también les ayudan. Me viene a la mente y al corazón, venid a mí, todos los que estáis fatigados y sobrecargados, y yo os daré descanso. Recemos para que las personas que sufren de depresión o agotamiento extremo reciban apoyo de todos y reciban una luz que les abra a la vida.
So now we want to welcome in our esteemed panel. We have Benson Makusha from the International Young Catholic Students. You'll be speaking later. We have Jennifer Marlin, a research scientist and lecturer at the Yale School of Environment and the Yale Program on Climate Change Communication. Dr. Judith Anderson, psychotherapist and the chair of Climate Psychology Alliance. And Aaron Lothis is an associate professor of theology and also a senior program manager of Laudato Si Animators program with the Laudato Si movement. Aaron will be joining us later as well. First, we want to start with Jennifer Marlin with the Yale School of Environment and Yale Program on Climate Change Communication. Jennifer, thanks so much for joining. And the floor is yours, as they say. I'll share your slides here in a second.
All right. Thank you so much for having me. It's an honor to be with you all today. And I'm very excited to talk a little bit about my research and the research of the Yale program on climate change communication. the issue of climate anxiety and hope about climate change is very important to me. And I want to start with a short story, which is about a survey question that we asked at the People's Climate March in New York City in 2014. We took a group of students to that climate march, and we asked over a couple hundred people what gave them hope. What made them come to this march. And it was interesting to hear all the different answers, because there has been growing climate anxiety and growing concern, but the people who were at that march showed up for different reasons. And the three reasons they said that gave them hope were one, well, many people actually said they didn't have hope until they arrived at the gathering, and then they saw all the people who felt the way they did, and that gave them hope. But another group said they actually didn't have hope, but they showed up and were taking action nonetheless, because they felt an obligation and responsibility to do that. And then the third group said, "Well, of course I'm hopeful. I always have hope." And they rattled off a whole bunch of examples of things that their neighbors, that politicians, that leaders in their community were doing already to address the problem. And for me, that just reinforced the idea that hope can come from many different sources, but also that sometimes we have to take action even when we don't have hope, but we feel that it is the right thing to do. But so I want to talk a little bit about going from climate anxiety to action, and I want to share some of our survey results, because I think one of the main misunderstandings that people have is that the situation is hopeless regarding climate, because the job is so big, the task is so large in front of us to reduce carbon emissions when they're coming from so many different sources. But in fact, many more people are worried and concerned and feel the way many of us do. Realize we underestimate how much other people feel the way we do about the issue. So this is some survey data. We've been collecting survey data for 13 years now, since 2008. And this is from the United States. It shows that Americans' belief that the problem is real, that global warming is happening, has increased 6 percentage points just in the last 6 months, from 70% to 76%. And you can see prior to that time, the levels had been quite flat. So something is happening right now. There is a change. Something is causing people to suddenly wake up a bit. And you can go to the next slide. We also find that while a strong majority in the US now believe it's happening, fewer think that they're being harmed right now, but it is now, for the first time in the history of our collection of the data, it's a majority, 55%. And again, we saw this large increase in just the past 6 months, a 10 percentage point increase in the people who in the US think they're being harmed right now. And we don't know exactly why this change has taken place, but we know that there is a level of anxiety, a level of concern that is increasing. And the first thought many of us had is the extreme weather. Many of us are seeing wildfires and flooding and hurricanes and heat waves worse than we've seen in the past. And that's part of the reason, but I think there are actually many other reasons, including leadership. Political leadership, community leadership, how people are talking about the issue, how our leaders are taking it more seriously, and how they're focusing on solutions. And that, I think, makes it clear and sends the signal that this really is a serious problem. And it's not just a distant problem happening, that's going to happen in 2100 or many decades into the future. It's an issue we need to address right now. Next slide. So one of the most useful types of research that we've produced in the past years has been a segmentation, a grouping of Americans according to how people think and feel and act in relation to climate change. And often we think of, in the US in particular, we think of it as just a political issue. Democrats think one way, Republicans think another way. But in fact, we all bring different views and different emotions and different thoughts and beliefs to this issue. And we find that there are 6 different groups, in fact. There are people who are alarmed, and it's 26% of people are alarmed as of December 2020. And in fact, our new data just came in, and that number is actually 33% now. We're about to release that data. So the alarmed, roughly a quarter, and these are people who think climate change is a serious threat, and it's happening now, it's urgent, and they strongly support aggressive actions to try to address it. Another 29% are concerned, meaning that they think it's a serious problem, but they don't necessarily think it's an urgent problem. 19% are cautious. These are people who are not sure what's causing the problem. Maybe it's humans, maybe it's volcanoes, or the sun or something else. They don't understand that. We know with near absolute certainty that it is human activities, and it is in fact burning of coal, oil, and gas that's producing the pollution that's warming the planet. So the cautious group is not clear on that. And they don't really understand the impacts. They don't understand that it's harming our health. It's harming our environment. It's changing the seasons, the snowfall, the rainfall patterns, and so on. The disengaged in the US are only about 6%. These are people who really don't know much at all about the issue and don't have an opinion. The doubtful are 12%, and this means that they're doubtful that the planet is even warming. And they think if it is warming, it must be due to natural cycles or something, even though we know from lots and lots of scientific evidence that it is definitely not a natural cycle. This is a human-caused problem. And then finally, 8% are dismissive, and these are folks who think that the scientists are making it up or have bad motivations, or they think this is just a hoax. Really, they're not convinced by any of the scientific evidence. And so these different groups it's skewed to the alarmed and concerned. The alarmed and concerned are the largest groups. And many people don't understand that. They think that the dismissive or doubtful groups are much bigger than they really are. The dismissive group is only 8%. It's a very small portion of the public. And yet, if you go on the internet, they're very vocal, they're very organized, they speak very loudly, and they're overrepresented in Congress in the US. Next slide. So what we see when we look over time is that the sizes of these groups are changing over time. And in particular, the dismissive are shrinking a little bit, and the cautious and the concerned shrank a little bit, but the alarmed is growing. And we've seen in our most recent survey that this is continuing even more. So people are sort of moving from being less persuaded to being very persuaded. And so this idea of anxiety is increasing, of concern is definitely increasing. And so it is important to figure out ways to sit with that uncertainty or sit with that anxiety, but then turn it into action. So the next slide shows that these 6 Americas, even though they're based on a segmentation in the US, we did apply it to other countries to see how the groups change in size depending on which country you look at. And what you see here is that the US is down, I think it's like number 18 there in bold. And so most of the countries, of the 31 countries we surveyed in collaboration with Facebook, most countries actually have many more alarmed and concerned. The dark green and the medium green colors, most countries really do believe this is a very serious problem. And most people support more aggressive action. And I think in part this is because many countries don't have as many resources as the US and as some of the European countries, and they understand that they are more vulnerable to changing weather patterns, to more drought, to water shortages, and that these damaging our natural resources can lead to conflict and lots of other challenges. So it's good to see that the United States, the alarmed and concerned portions are growing and becoming more in line with the rest of the country, or rest of the world. So next slide here. So we ask these different segments of the public, if you could ask an expert on global warming one question, which question would you ask? And we found 3 different responses to that. For the alarmed and concerned, they want to know what the solutions are. How can we fix this problem? And so most of the public in the US and most of the public around the world actually this is the question that's at the top of their mind. What can we do? How can we fix this? How can we make this better? And so that's really where the conversation has to happen now. And we have so many solutions. There are so many things we can talk about, from changing our diets to using less energy to stopping the, creating electricity by burning fossil fuels and electrifying everything, a phrase that you might have heard, because if we electrify everything, we can clean up our electrical grids with renewable energy like solar and wind. And so there are solutions all around us. We need to be talking more about that. The middle groups, the cautious and the disengaged, want to know what harm will it cause and why should I care, basically, because they're thinking about other things. They don't see this as a pressing threat that they should deal with. So those groups really need to hear more about, how do changing weather patterns affect me? How does it affect food and agriculture? How does it affect my health? Why should I care? So we need to talk with these groups about those impacts. And help them understand that we all have to care about this and find ways to move forward on it. And then finally, the doubtful and dismissive groups want to know, how do you know that global warming is even happening? How do you know that it's human caused? And sometimes really there's a subtext there, which is, why should I trust you? Are you like me? Are you coming from the groups that I value and trust? And so maybe those folks need to be talking with other people who are more like them to help them understand how solid the science is. And in fact, 97% of scientists now say that climate change is happening, it's human caused, it's a serious threat. So there is virtually no debate in the scientific community about this issue. Next slide. So we need to have all these conversations, but we are not having them. And part of dealing with anxiety, I think sometimes it's just going inward, and sitting and dealing with it yourself. But more often it's talking about the causes and the possible solutions and just reaching out to friends and family. And when it comes to climate change, most of us are not talking about it with our family and friends. Even though if we did talk about it, we would find that they care as much as we do and that there are solutions. There are ways we can contribute and work in a common direction. Next slide. Only 25% of Americans hear about global warming in the media at least once a week. So we're not really talking about it with family and friends. We're not hearing about it from the media as much as you might think. If you're the type of person who listens to environmental news and looks for it, then you're actually not in the majority. Most people are not doing that. And so it's so important for the media and organizations and just individuals to share information about the issue and to bring it up in conversation and to seek solutions. So next slide. And I'm not going to share this video, but it's worth just looking it up if you have a moment, because it talks about the most important thing you can do to fight climate change, and which would help in dealing with anxiety, and that is simply to talk about it. It's not something that's incredibly difficult. It's a simple thing to do. It's to have a conversation, because those conversations lead to acceptance and give us time to really think about, what does this mean for us, and how is it going to change us, and what can we do to spread awareness and help motivate action. Catherine Hayhoe is an evangelical from Texas. Actually, she's Canadian, but living in Texas, and she's a powerful speaker and a wonderful storyteller. And she explains in detail why the most important thing we can do to fight climate change is to start talking about it more. So that's it for me. I think next slide. I think, I just have some resources here. If you're interested in learning more about the survey research or our international report, you can find it here. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jennifer. Fascinating information. A couple takeaways for me. Only 8% people are dismissive of the climate crisis, that it's happening. So 92% are ready to be, I mean, they're not alarmed, but they're ready to take
They're
action
open.
and kind of join this. Yeah, they're open. Yeah.
Yes, true.
Yeah,
Yes,
fascinating.
and I think sometimes if I show those bubbles and don't provide the numbers, you can guess and let people imagine, and people will often imagine that that group is much larger. So it's a widespread misperception. We underestimate how much people are on the other side of the spectrum.
Yeah, because you hear, like you said, you hear so much about the deniers, or the loud minority. So
Right. And they are
go ahead.
more in our leadership.
Yeah.
The halls of Congress, yes, there are more dismissives and doubtful. So that is representative of the American public as a whole. The surveys are conducted on all American adults over age 18. But if we were to survey politicians, of course, it would be a different story.
Yeah. Very good. Well, thank you, Jennifer. We will come back to you when we chat in a bit here. Now we want to welcome in Dr. Judith Anderson, with the Climate Psychology Alliance. Dr. Judith, thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you. I'm going to dive deeper into the feelings and thoughts about climate change of young people. And I think this really adds very much to the previous speaker's presentation. So it would be helpful to, could you use the display view, if that's possible? That's great. This is the outline findings from the largest research globally into children and young people's feelings and thoughts about climate change, and how these actually impact on their daily functioning, and further, how it correlates with their beliefs and experiences about government inaction. And I'm going to be talking numbers for some of the time, but I want to be very mindful that these are actually how children and young people tell us how they feel. So they're not just numbers. And some of what I'm going to be saying may seem quite devastating. But what's been very interesting for the researchers who've done this work is that in many presentations over the last 2 months since this research launched, and it's going to be published in The Lancet next week, when asked afterwards how they feel about this research, children and young people repeatedly say, "Thank you, this is such a relief. This is how I feel." And I think what that tells us is that if we're looking to move climate angst to climate action, we really have to look deeply at climate angst. We mustn't dismiss it. We have to face its reality. The logo of Climate Psychology Alliance is facing difficult truths. So I'm going to tell you some difficult truths about how children and young people all over the world are feeling about climate change. And as you see in this slide, the survey was of 10,000 children and young people in 10 different countries. Next slide, please. And 8 out of 10 worry that climate change is threatening people and the planet. And given the figures we heard, it is no wonder that the figure of 8 out of 10 is greater than the perhaps 5 to 6 out of 10 of adults. And 45% are reporting a negative impact on their daily functioning, eating, concentrating, work, school. Could you skip 2 slides, please? Thank you. So in this slide, which you can see in the research when it comes out, climate change makes me feel 63% named sadness, another 62% anxiety and afraid, and others felt angry and powerless. Those were the figures worldwide, and we're looking at the research in different countries. You could skip ahead, please. Next one after that. Thank you. So over half of young people think that they won't have access to the same opportunities that their parents had. Next. Over half think their family's security will be threatened. And some of these children and young people are living in areas where coastal inundation is actually happening. They're seeing climate change on their doorstep. Next slide. Over half think that the things they most value will be destroyed. And next, 8 out of 10 think that people have failed to take care of the planet, which of course is actually what the scientists are telling us as well. So there's something really important here, that young people are listening to the science as well as seeing what's happening in their own countries. 3/4 think that the future is frightening. And in the UK, 38% and 39% worldwide are hesitant to have children because of climate change. And there have been other studies that show these kind of figures. This is very salutary. Over half think that humanity is doomed. So if you can skip another one. Now, this is so important, and I think this really has to be taken on board by all of us who care about ethics, because nearly half of children and young people are feeling dismissed or ignored by others when they try and talk about climate change. And when I was looking at these figures this afternoon, what came into my mind is, suffer the little children to come unto me and forbid them not. And I think we have to have young people come to us with whatever they're feeling and really take it on board. And finally, this is quite a big slide, but again, you'll be able to see it in the paper. Many young people feel that governments are failing. They're failing young people. They're lying about the impact of their actions. They're dismissing distress. People felt betrayed by governments. Thank you. So if you could switch the slides off now. So in this study, children and young people are sharing their hurt with the researchers. And what's also very important, that what this shows is that children are suffering a moral injury by the inaction of governments. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Judith. I wanted to follow up a very, not depressing, but very heavy presentation. One slide in particular that stood out to me was how I think over half of young people think that something they love or cherish will be destroyed in their
Yes.
lifetime. Now, I don't know how much of a detail, but we're talking, maybe nature or something they love. What specifically stood out to you about all the numbers? What was the most impactful?
For me, I think it's the two are that they have had the experience of their feelings and their thoughts about climate change being dismissed. I think that is very salutary. because what we know about all kinds of trauma suffered by young people and adults is that what helps us survive is when we're listened to and the feelings we have are validated. So if we're talking about engaging young people and young people having the courage to step up and become the kind of adults who take action, they're going to be much more likely to do this if they're listened to, if they're heard, if their feelings are validated. That puts them in a much more resilient place to be the kind of adults that the world is going to need in a few years' time. And now,
Mm-hmm. How do you, just quickly, how do you say, so I come to you, I'm a young person, and I say, I'm Dr. Judith, I'm really worried about like the climate crisis, what's happening. What is a good way to respond to anyone, young person, middle-aged, older person? How do you handle that? What would you say?
Well, that's really interesting. I think we have to let go a little bit of our therapist anonymity and we actually say, you know what, I'm concerned too. And I want to know more. What is it that really troubles you? What's the worst fear you have? So I would acknowledge it myself, but then I'd want to rapidly focus back on them. What is it that really bothers you?
So kind of join them in that feeling and then inquire more and then meet them where they are.
Yes.
Kind of. Yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Fascinating, Dr. Judith. Thank you so much. We will be coming back to you and we have a broader discussion in a little bit. Now we want to welcome Benson Makusho with the Pan-African Coordinator for the International Young Catholic Students. Benson, thanks so much for joining us. How's everything going?
Good. Thank you. Can you hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you perfectly. Yeah. We've talked a lot about, Dr. Anderson and Jennifer spoke a lot about young people, how they're feeling. You, young person yourself, you talk to young people all the time throughout the continent of Africa. What are you hearing? What are you hearing in terms of climate angst, climate anxiety, and how to turn that into action? Just what are you hearing overall in your work?
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you very much. And I would like to appreciate those that also were speaking before me. And some of the issues are really cross-cutting if you look at them from this side. But also, I would like to give a perspective which is more focused on the youths in Africa. Like you said, Jonathan, yes, I'm a young person myself, and I work with young people across Africa. And climate change is really a big issue, and it's something that's bringing about a lot of instability and anxiety as well amongst the young people. It's also important to note that as Africa or sub-Saharan Africa, the contribution of emissions is very little, but then the effects of climate change are actually felt more in this sub-Saharan Africa. There's a lot of change now in the rainfall patterns, and Africa is really pretty much agro-based, and this is hitting hard on agriculture, and also is becoming a threat to food security. I mean, this is something that's of great concern to young people. What's our future going to be like if economies are going down? Where are we going to go? There's a lot of high unemployment because of these shifts that are happening within agriculture, which is actually one of the key backbones of most economies here in Africa. Maybe just to give a bit of figures here, we were looking at about 11 million people who are experiencing crisis or emergency levels of food insecurity in Southern Africa. And also, there's a lot of displacement that is happening, and environmental degradation. With about, right now, we are counting to about 86 million internal climate migrants, and most of these are young people. The ones that are being affected, and there are real worries with them, amongst them, to say, so what is our future going to be like? We are not contributing anything as much to this crisis, but then why is it we are the ones who are bearing these effects, and who is there who is going to do something about it? These are the conversations that are coming out. Who is going to do something about it? Who is going to look at us? So you find that there are high levels of unemployment. There's a lot of anxiety amongst the young people because it seems there's no hope. We just carried out a simple, quick snap survey, and some of the responses that were coming were like, we don't know where to go. We don't know what our future holds. This is a hopeless situation. These are some of the I'm just reading out some of the responses that were coming out. And you see, there's been increase in conflicts in Africa, climate change related conflicts, and again, young people are at the center of these conflicts, so they are finding themselves always in a vulnerable state. Being used as also political weapons. But all this is coming out because these conflicts have emanated from the effects of climate change. If you look in the Sahel, most of the conflicts they're actually climate related conflicts, and this is actually affecting the young people who are one of the most vulnerable groups within Africa. And actually, young people is the account for about 60% of people in Africa. So all these effects that are coming of climate change, they're actually hitting on that key demography of Africa. So in a nutshell, there's a lot of worry to say what then is our future as young people, and our governments are incapacitated right now to deal with having mitigating measures, and also to building on resilience. There are no resources, so it looks very hopeless. Because it doesn't look like there's any hope in sight. From the deliberations also at COPE, young people are also looking forward to outcomes that we're also going to bring about positive. They're looking for positive outcomes in terms of the financing that could possibly help Africa, and also to build on their resilience. So there's a lot of anxiety now. There's a lot of worry. There's a lot of talk. So where are we going? There are a lot of comments around to say we are alone. If you look around on Twitter, if you look around on Instagram, we are alone. Glasgow didn't deliver. So that one is really creating a lot of anxiety amongst the
Yeah.
young people. Yeah.
Benson, if I can,
So
let me quickly interrupt you. Sorry. How do you, sitting with that anger that you've heard, and that, we're alone, like it's not our problem, yet it's become like we didn't cause this, but it's our problem now. How do you try to transform that into action, into, what, you're right, like what are the different things you try to do with your work? Because obviously you don't go around saying, yeah, we're doomed, right? How do you kind of transform that into some sort of action in your network?
yeah, I think what we're trying to do is actually pretty much having a lot of conversations. To also, the first thing as well is also to get them to understand themselves at their own local contributing as well to climate change. And then before we can even talk about the larger scale, but then to bring about hope, we're creating a lot of conversations to bring about hope, and also to try to continue to within the local communities as much as they can, so that for some mitigating measures to be put in place, so that we can start to see a bit of change. So what we're trying to do pretty much is to create conversations, creating listening circles, because sometimes it's also important that they are just listened to, their concerns are listened to, and then from there, that is when we can also start to build back together.
Mm. Okay, so kind of it's
So
similar in a
thank you,
way what,
Jonathan, for that.
yeah, 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 similar in a way to what Dr. Judith was saying, listening to people and having those conversations, to touch on Jennifer's point as well. That's kind of the starting point. You've seen that bring about success then, and having those conversations as a starting point.
Yes, sure. It does, because, like I was saying, here the effects then they turn into many other things, like wars, and also the displacements, like we're saying. So there's a lot around. There's a lot of fear around young people. So you need to start to listen to them, and then start to bring about environment for them to know that no, they can be heard, and their issues. Everyone is understanding their issues, but then we can work together together, we can move together, we can get out of this together. That's most important. And with those conversations, you start to see them participating and also getting engaged.
Fascinating. Fantastic. Thank you, Benson. We will come back to you in just a little bit. Now we want to turn to Dr. Erin Lopez she's associate professor and the associate professor of theology at St. Elizabeth's University, and he's senior program manager of the Laudato Si Animators program with Laudato Si Movement. Also the author of 2 books, Inspired Sustainability, Planting Seeds for Action, and The Paradox of Christian Sacrifice, The Loss of Self, and The Gift of Self. Erin, thanks so much for joining us. Wanted to talk with you about, as someone who knows the church history and is a theologian, past, and we've talked before about how, this creation care movement can kind of be to move the church in a direction, a renewal movement, as I say. But how, in your studies, in your research, surely there's examples that history can teach us on kind of where we go from here with this anxiety, with this angst, and how we can turn it into something positive.
Thank you, Jonathan, and thank you to all the other presenters for a very rich discussion of a truly challenging issue, because when people feel overwhelmed and anxious, they freeze and they can't take action, and we need to support them to carry on in this path. As Pope Francis says, with joy, let us sing as we go. And boy, that sounds like a really, really tall order, but it's one we're summoned to. And I think it's part of what makes action possible. And if I could suggest 2 words to describe a faith-based response, and maybe a response for anyone who's engaged in the climate fight, it would be solidarity and spirituality, however you interpret spirituality, and whatever solidarity might mean to you. But in the history of the church, people have joined forces with many battles for justice, whether it was assisting refugees throughout history, aligning with the poor, whether it was joining the fights for abolition and civil rights, and today standing with Indigenous people. Taking a stance of solidarity has always been a way to put one's belief in action, to put love for one's fellow brother and sister into action. And that is truly a way to see one's values alive and to feel that we are moving forward towards creating the sort of world that we want. We are so terribly challenged by the ecological crisis, by the climate crisis, the biodiversity crisis. It truly is a crisis at an unprecedented level. But for those who have suffered throughout history, through colonialism, through racism, through sexism, their problems have always been existential crises of the highest sort. So we are always called to this solidarity. And I think we see signs of hope in those who take outrageous action. So these heroes of courage and bravery, such as Greta, who I think stuns us all with what she's able to do, and inspire each of us to do our part and to join in solidarity with her. So what makes that hard to do? What makes it hard to take action? Next slide, please. What I've studied in talking to many faith-based environmentalists around the United States from all faith traditions is that there are many teachings about eco-spirituality, many teachings that urge us to care for the climate, yet very often these doctrines, these messages aren't enough to inspire people to act. Now, when people do act, they tend to have 7 things in common. They tend to have a high scientific literacy. So that echoes what Jen was saying about those who are alarmed and concerned. They know there's a problem, and so they're motivated to act. They have a strong sense of interdependence and know that we're all affected. We're all impacted ultimately. We can't isolate the problems. They're committed to social justice as a tenet of their faith. And they honor a bigger God who cares for the whole cosmos, all the creatures, every ecosystem, not just the human soul. And along with that reverence for creation, they work with people of multiple faiths and tend to be independent thinkers, willing to go out and take action on an issue that all too often is not discussed, that is not shared, that has not been public. Next slide. So what I found is that there are 3 gaps holding people back from action. The knowledge gap, where people are neither convinced nor concerned. Perhaps this is the dismissive, the doubtful. The caring gap, where they know but are conflicted due to issues in their own lives that distract them from taking action. And then the action gap, where people know about the problem, care about the problem, but aren't sure what to do. And here's where sharing solutions is so important. Next slide, please. The knowledge gap can be met by reducing scientific literacy limitations, by overcoming the cognitive limitations of how we think about the problem, and urging people to overcome their resistance. Very often it's convenient to overlook climate change because it makes a demand of us, a demand on our lifestyles. Next slide, please. We know that our societies worldwide are cursed with consumerism, with a desire to keep in step with progress. We're distracted by our busy lives. These are all issues that Pope Francis has pointed to: the throwaway society, the rapidification of modern life. These don't leave time for living simply, for living sustainably, for even writing a letter to our congressperson. And these are all things that we must do. So even a person who cares may be conflicted about doing the right thing. Next slide. So a way to lead past the caring gap is to engage in discussion that reaches into our core values, that align with our identities, that connect with who we really are and what matters in our faith, that highlight the link between climate change information and core values. What about our faith, our belief in the dignity of every person's right to clean water, to a stable home, to a sustainable livelihood? These are convictions that we have in our faith, and it motivates us to act. And discussions enable us to make those connections firmer and bring them to the forefront of our minds. So discussions explore the synthesis of ecological concerns and faith identity and strengthen both. And having these discussions in familiar groups, like a parish, is a safe space. So in the Laudato Si movement, we support Laudato Si circles as places to have these discussions, as places to pray over how we feel, to discuss our climate anxiety, to lift it up in prayer, and to transform it into action and hope. And we find there the moral support that's so important when we're dealing with these overwhelming angst-causing problems. Next slide, please. And the action gap refers to that situation of caring, but just being challenged to do the right thing. We're all busy. We're all comfortable in our lives. Some of us, the privileged. Others are experiencing the impacts tragically and suffer instead from a lack of resources and a lack of agency. Being overwhelmed is a serious problem, and not being able to wrestle with this climate agency directly, as Dr. Judith shared. Next slide, please. So again, having conversations, as Dr. Hayhoe said, as Dr. Jen referenced, these are ways to make it a problem that we can talk about, that we can discuss, and that as a community we can engage in. And as a faith community, it becomes part of who we are and our deepest values. Our shared values reinforce individual actions. We realize we're not alone. Group identity promotes a willingness to choose delayed benefits, makes it easier to undertake sacrificial decisions because we're doing this together. And then our networks leverage our individual activity. Instead of being one person, we're a community taking action, and that leads to greater success at a higher scale. And of course, it's more fun. It's more meaningful to be acting together. This is isolating because so few people talk about climate change. So we need to work together. Next slide, please. And in addition to the theme of solidarity and working together, this truly is a spiritual crisis that people of faith are called to ponder very deeply. It's not a trivial or a light problem to ponder the degradation of creation, the suffering of millions and millions of persons and creatures, the conversion of God's beautiful world into a pile of filth. We need to reckon sincerely with the question, why does God allow this to happen? It becomes not just a question of climate anxiety, but of profound theological doubt. And this is a question we need to reckon with. In our Christian faith, we honor God as creator, and that is God's fundamental identity. And we can always take hope and faith in who God is as creator. This is what we hold on to, even while knowing that we have been given the responsibility to be co-creators, and we need to act as co-creators to preserve our common home. At the same time, we do this humbly, knowing we are finite. We cannot do everything. All of us have multiple other responsibilities. Yet to acknowledge them and say, I may not be able to do everything. I am finite, but I do have choices, and I can do many things better that are sustainable, that will create a better planet, that will be actions that matter. And together, we are the church, holding the inspiration of the Spirit as the Holy Spirit renews the earth. So as the scripture saying goes, unless a grain of wheat falls to the ground and die, it remains a single grain. But if it dies, it yields a rich harvest. And so all of the gifts of time and of action that we offer have the potential to yield a great harvest in the makings of a new ecological civilization, the bold cultural revolution that Pope Francis calls for. Next slide. So Laudato Si invites us to choose gratitude and joy, that along with our inevitable anxiety. And I'd just like to pause here and note the beautiful words from the Mass that in English said, preserve us from needless anxiety. And that's so important. We should be saved from needless anxiety, but there is some important, if not anxiety, concern that motivates us and drives us to take action within the context of a larger vision of the ongoing creation of the cosmos. God is present to each being, and creation is ongoing. Laudato Si calls us to be comforted in that Christ is present to every being, surrounding it and blessing it, and that creation is a loving gift to each of us, as we are a gift to ourselves and to others as we work together in a spirit of solidarity and spirituality. Thank you.
Thank you, Erin, so much for the wonderful presentation. And it's interesting as we welcome everyone back into the chat, into the presentation, how a lot of the things that the different speakers said, all kind of, they came from different backgrounds, different institutions, different places throughout the world, but they all kind of rhyme, right? Did you all find similarities as well? And what similarities about turning climate angst into climate action stood out to you all?
Can you all hear me?
Yep, perfect.
Okay, great. Yes, thank you so much to all of you. Those presentations were really inspiring and interesting, and touched on the many different aspects of this difficult situation we find ourselves in. I appreciate the emphasis here on the gravity of the problem, the seriousness of it, and I think each of you pointed that out. That many of us, I think, in the climate movement and who are focused on trying to reach out to others, we have to really think carefully about how can we acknowledge this situation, and acknowledge the feelings and the anxiety and the damage that is already being done. As Benson, as you were talking about, and recognize how climate change really is a threat multiplier. As many people have said, it exacerbates all of the problems that we already have. We're already, and especially in the global South, people are suffering from energy poverty, from lack of water and food. And there is already existing conflict and corruption. And then along comes climate change, caused mostly by countries in the North, the US and Europe, and it's making all of these existing problems worse. And so how do we acknowledge all this and help people feel heard, and yet, as the purpose of this discussion is to try to find ways to do that effectively, so that we avoid the needless anxiety, as Erin was just saying, and yet recognize the real, the valid anxiety, and how do we transform that to action. I think one of the big takeaways for me is the importance of deep listening, and acknowledgement, and just of making space. And so it's a process of raising awareness still, but also trying to move towards acceptance of the seriousness. Because I think still a majority of us in most countries, even around the world, are still struggling with, accepting how serious the degradation already is. But until we can accept that seriousness and really look at what is already happening and say, okay, yes, this is real. And then only then, after we've gone through the awareness process and the acceptance process, can we start to even think about action, because we want to make sure that the actions we take are the right actions, that they're going to improve things and not make them worse. And so it is a process. We don't get over 7 billion people to sort of start working together and just fix this. Clearly, it's an enormous challenge. But I heard a lot of synergies among what everyone was saying there, and hearing these conversations, excuse me, does give me hope. So the talking about it is definitely important.
Dr. Judith, yeah, go ahead.
I want to say, Benson, that it is important we hear what you're saying. And we're very aware in the UK of how white and middle class our environmental movements are. And I think the same is in the US. And we hear you and we want to keep hearing you. And so thank you for what you said. It's salutary. I think eco-anxiety, climate anxiety and angst is also a sign of eco-empathy. And that's where the gratitude comes in that Erin spoke to, that it is a place of connection And our Royal College of Psychiatrists in the UK is quite clear that climate anxiety is not an illness. It's an appropriate response. And part of that appropriate response is from an awareness of interconnection, an awareness of all those things that Erin was talking about, of the connection and the moral issues. And I think that's really important. That's what we're seeing with young people. That's all. We're short of time, I'm watching. But thank you for having me on.
No, very well said. It's not climate anxiety is not an illness. It is an appropriate response. Benson, what would you like to add?
Thank you very much. Yeah, I think I really also see a lot of similarities also in terms of how we can also deal with this issue. I think what's very important is really explaining to the young people that really the feelings they are real, and also the more we also talk with them, it's also a sign of caring, because there is need for that to show some love and care to them. And creating those listening circles, listening platforms, I think it gives that safe space for them to share how they are feeling. And then I think from there, like what was being said earlier, that's how we can also start to talk about action after we've already done a bit of healing and a bit of understanding of where we're coming from. So yeah, I think I would like to stress that creating space and those platforms to listen to the young people is the first step. Yeah.
Well said. Thank you, Benson. Creating space, talking about the climate crisis, and having eco-empathy, like you said, Dr. Judith. Erin, how can you close us out, inspire us to go and solve everything that ails us? No pressure, of course, but
well, I would echo what our other presenters have said, that sometimes there feels like there is no hope, but we have to act anyway. And when we begin and take those first steps, especially if we can find others to walk with, we feel that we are not alone. And taking those steps begins a habit that reinforces and strengthens us. And being with others helps us know that we have the support and the power to carry along. And if we trust as well in God, the Creator, who has a plan and who has given us a serious responsibility that we cannot abandon, there is the chance to use the solutions that do exist and to use the wise sciences that are partners with us, the wise sciences of climate communication, climate psychology. These offer great tools to help us be wise as serpents and gentle as doves, so that we communicate intelligently, and we communicate intelligently with those we need to partner with, sharing solutions, sharing good ideas, building a new ecological civilization together. So I would say stretch out our hands, look for partners, and aim as much as we can to take up Pope Francis's invitation to sing as we go.
Mm-hmm. And just start it anyway, right? It's not going to be a perfect start. It might be a false start, but move forward in some way.
Absolutely.
Fantastic. Well, thank you everyone so much for your wisdom. I feel like we could unpack kind of each of these for another hour or two and kind of, okay, how do we do this? How do we do this? But we will let you all go for now. But thank you again. And thank you to everyone who participated through the chat. We had people from all over the world, Pakistan, Zambia, the US, all over. So thank you again. God bless. And we will be in touch, perhaps a future dialogue, or perhaps we definitely need to continue this conversation. As you all said, keep talking about it. So thank you again.
Thank you.